Someone played dirty with you. Maybe it happened recently, so recently that you can identify the exact moment it landed. Not the moment you found out, which might have been different, the actual moment of impact, where you were standing, what the light looked like, the specific quality of the silence that followed, when the full meaning of what had just happened arrived in your body before your mind had caught up with it. That particular cold recognition, not surprise exactly, because some part of you had always known something was slightly wrong, slightly off, slightly not quite what it appeared, but the arrival of confirmation. The moment the suspicion became knowledge, the moment the warmth you had been receiving from this person was revealed as the delivery mechanism for something else entirely. Or maybe it happened a long time ago. Months, years even. And you have been carrying it in the specific way that unresolved betrayals travel inside a person who has not yet found the right framework for understanding them. Not always at the surface, not always shouting, but present. Present in the particular way you pause now before extending yourself to someone new. Present in the careful calibration you have developed, often unconscious, often operating just beneath your awareness, about how much of yourself you allow to be visible before you pull back and reassess. Present in the 3 in the morning replays, the reconstructed conversations, the mental simulations of what you should have said, could have said, what might have happened if you had seen it sooner, acted differently, chosen differently, been less open, less trusting, less foolishly, persistently, pointlessly generous with someone who was cataloging your generosity as an asset to be converted at the appropriate moment into something useful to them. I know you are tired. I know that what you wanted, what you still want, somewhere beneath the layers of management and coping and moving forward, is not strategy or philosophy or frameworks. What you wanted is the thing that betrayal takes from you that is hardest to name and hardest to recover. The ability to be in a relationship with another human being without the part of you that knows better running constant background checks. The ability to trust without the simultaneous exhausting process of wondering when and how the trust will be used against you. The ability to be simply, fully, generously present, the way you were before someone taught you through their actions that being present that way has a cost that not everyone who receives your presence deserves to be trusted with. That ability is not gone. It is not permanently damaged, but it needs something from you that no amount of healing or forgiveness or moving on has been able to provide. Because healing, forgiveness and moving on are backward-looking processes. They address what was done. They do not address the structural vulnerability that allowed it to happen. And until the structural vulnerability is understood and addressed, the healing will be real and the trust will rebuild. And then something similar will happen again, at a different angle, from a different direction. And you will find yourself back in the same place wondering how you missed it again. What you need is not more healing. What you need is more intelligence. Pay very close attention to what I am about to lay out for you, because what follows is not what you have been offered before. It is not the softened, comforting, emotionally safe version of these insights, the version designed to make the medicine go down without upsetting anyone, without challenging anyone's preferred image of human goodness, without forcing the kind of uncomfortable clarity that real strategic intelligence requires. This is the actual version, the one that Niccolo Machiavelli spent his entire adult life developing and documenting in some of the most precise and unflinching writing about human nature and the mechanics of power that the modern world has ever produced. And before we go any further, let me address what you think you know about Machiavelli, because what you think you know has been carefully managed, in the same way that a great deal of genuinely useful information about how the world actually works has been carefully managed, carefully packaged, in a way that serves the interests of those who benefit from most people not having access to it, and carefully condemned in a way that ensures that the condemnation is what gets transmitted, while the content itself remains accessible only to those who know to look past the condemnation to the actual substance. Machiavelli was a Florentine diplomat, historian, and political philosopher. He lived and worked in one of the most complex political environments in human history, Renaissance Italy, where the political landscape was a continuous exercise in alliance and betrayal, where city-states competed with each other and with the papacy and with foreign powers, in a constant multi-dimensional game of survival and advantage, where a trusted ally could become a mortal enemy within a season, and where the quality of a ruler's political intelligence was literally a matter of life and death, not just for the ruler, but for everyone who depended on their governance. He watched all of this with extraordinary precision and took meticulous notes. What he wrote, The Prince, the Discourses, the History of Florence, is not a manual for how to be corrupt. It is something much more dangerous and much more useful. It is an accurate description of how power actually operates, stripped of the comfortable fictions and the moralistic overlays that make those fictions feel necessary. He wrote, famously, that a man who wishes to make a profession of goodness in everything must necessarily fail among so many who are not good. He did not write this to encourage people to be bad. He wrote it as an observation about reality. The same kind of observation that a doctor makes about the presence of pathogens in an environment. Not to celebrate the pathogens, but to give the patient the information they need to maintain their health in an environment where pathogens exist and will continue to exist, regardless of anyone's preference that they do not. They condemned him for the honesty, called him the devil's architect, used his name as shorthand for manipulation and immorality, and continued in their private rooms and their private deliberations to apply every insight he documented to their governance, their diplomacy, their commerce, their social navigation. The condemnation was public, the application was private, and the ordinary person, the person who was not in those private rooms, who did not have access to the private application, was left with nothing but the condemnation. Left to operate in a world where some people understood how the game was played and others did not, and the gap between those two groups produced the specific, predictable, recurring pattern of naivety exploited, trust betrayed, wound carried, healing sought, structural vulnerability unchanged, pattern repeated. You are not going to repeat the pattern. Not after today. What follows is 10 principles, 10 operational frameworks drawn from Machiavelli's most precise and most overlooked insights, applied specifically to the situation you are currently navigating, the situation of someone who has been played dirty and is deciding what to do next. These are not abstract philosophical concepts to contemplate from a safe distance. They are practical tools. They change behavior. They change perception. They change the way you move through the specific environment where the betrayal occurred. And they change permanently, structurally, at the level of how you see rather than just what you see, the quality of your intelligence about human nature. This is not going to make you cold. Let me be emphatic about this because it matters to you. I know it does, and it should matter to you. The qualities that make you who you are, your warmth, your genuine desire for connection, your capacity for real trust and real loyalty and real investment in the people and projects that deserve it, these are not the problem. They were never the problem. The problem was the absence of the layer underneath them, the layer of discernment, the layer of evidence-based assessment, the layer of strategic awareness that should have been supporting and protecting the warmth, the openness, the generosity, not replacing them but serving as the foundation on which they could be safely and fully expressed. What these 10 principles build is that layer. The intelligence underneath the warmth, the precision underneath the generosity, the strategic clarity underneath the openness. And when that layer is in place, when it is not a set of rules you apply consciously, but an instinct that operates at the level of reflex, as natural as breathing, you will be everything you want to be. Open, warm, generous, connected, trusting where trust is earned. And entirely, quietly, permanently unplayable, that is the promise, here is the work. There is a behavioral portrait that Machiavelli drew repeatedly across his work, never using these exact terms, but with a consistency and precision that makes the pattern unmistakable once you know to look for it. It is the portrait of the person who plays dirty. And before you can navigate the situation you are in, before you can make the 10 moves with any accuracy or effectiveness, you need this portrait in enough detail that it functions not as a description of someone you already know, but as a template, a pattern recognition guide that will serve you in every environment you enter for the rest of your life. Because here is the thing about this kind of person. They are not rare. This is the uncomfortable truth that most frameworks for dealing with betrayal conspicuously avoid, because acknowledging it requires a revision of the comfortable narrative about human goodness that most people find more sustaining than the accurate one. The person who played dirty with you is not an anomaly. They are not a statistical outlier in the population of human beings. They are a recognizable type, a behavioral pattern that appears in varying degrees of sophistication and deliberateness across every professional environment you will ever work in, every social circle you will ever belong to, every domain of human activity where resources, status, influence, or security are in play, which is every domain, which means this person is always somewhere in your vicinity. And the gap between the life of someone who can recognize and respond to this pattern early and the life of someone who cannot is enormous, measured in years of recovery from situations that could have been prevented, in energy diverted from genuine building into damage management, in the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being surprised by the same move, from different players, across multiple contexts over time. You are closing that gap now. Let the portrait be complete. The first feature of this behavioral pattern is situational ethics, a relationship to moral principles that is fundamentally contingent rather than principled. This distinction is subtle and important. The person with situational ethics is not uniformly dishonest. They are not operating with a constant, conscious intention to deceive or manipulate everyone around them all the time. In most circumstances, most of the time, their behavior is entirely within normal ethical expectations. They are honest when honesty is easy. They are fair when fairness costs them nothing. They are considerate and warm and generous in circumstances where those qualities serve their position or simply require no particular sacrifice. They may be genuinely kind to people who pose no competitive threat. They may be scrupulously reliable in domains where reliability serves their reputation. They may have real friendships and real loyalties to specific people whose value in their life is consistently high. The situational nature of their ethics only becomes visible at the margin, at the specific moment when honesty would cost them an advantage, when fairness would require genuine sacrifice, when maintaining the terms of an implicit agreement would interfere with something they want. At that margin, the principled person holds. The discomfort of honesty in that moment is real, and they hold through it because their commitment to their principles is not contingent on the comfort of the circumstances. The person with situational ethics calculates. They weigh the cost of honoring the implicit agreement against the benefit of the available alternative, and they choose accordingly. If the benefit is large enough and the risk of consequence small enough, they choose themselves, every time. Without the kind of internal conflict that a principled person would experience, because their orientation to morality was never principled to begin with, it was always strategic. You look back now and you can see the margin. You can identify with the clarity of retrospect the specific moment or series of moments when this person made the calculation and chose accordingly. Maybe it was obvious only in hindsight. Maybe there were signals that were visible in real time, but that you chose, for various understandable reasons, not to fully register. One of those reasons is the second feature of the portrait, which operates specifically to prevent early accurate assessment. The second feature is the talent for social mirroring, the ability to absorb and reflect back, with extraordinary precision, the specific qualities, values, and emotional needs of the person in front of them. This is not always calculated. In many people who eventually play dirty, mirroring is an ingrained relational strategy, developed early in life as a response to an environment where genuine self-expression was risky or insufficient, and where adapting to the expectations of others produced better outcomes. Over years of practice, it becomes automatic. They do not necessarily know they are doing it. They may genuinely experience the warmth they express toward you, the interest they show in your life, the alignment they demonstrate with your values as real, and in a sense they are real, in the moment, because this person has a genuine talent for inhabiting the version of themselves that produces the most favorable response in the specific person they are with. The effect of skilled mirroring on the person being mirrored is powerful and well documented. When someone reflects your values back to you with accuracy and warmth, You experience the specific feeling of being deeply understood, of being seen in a way that is uncommon and precious, and that creates a sense of connection that accelerates past what the actual history of the relationship warrants. You feel close to this person faster than you should. You extend trust before you have gathered the evidence that would normally support it. You feel, without being able to fully articulate why, that this person simply gets you, that the usual labor of making yourself understood is unnecessary here, that you can be more fully yourself in this relationship than in most others. That feeling is not an illusion. The connection you experienced was real as an experience, but it was produced by someone whose talent is not authentic relating. It is accurate performance of authentic relating. And the distinction, which is invisible from the inside of the experience, only becomes visible when the performance serves them better by stopping than by continuing. At that point, the warmth recedes. The mirroring stops, and the person who received it is left not only with the wound of the specific betrayal, but with the disorientation of losing what felt like one of the more genuine connections in their life. Both of these losses are real, and both need to be understood for what they are. Not evidence that your desire for deep connection is a weakness, but evidence that the person you were connecting with had a specific, rare and operationally sophisticated ability to simulate the experience of deep connection. Your desire for real connection is not the problem. Your inability, and before now, to distinguish between the real experience of connection and a skilled performance of it was the structural vulnerability that made you accessible to this particular kind of play. The third feature of the portrait, and Machiavelli would identify this as the most strategically significant, the one that constitutes the clearest signature of someone who will eventually play dirty, is a specific relationship to information. For people who operate with ordinary social ethics, information shared in the context of a relationship is simply content. It is the substance of mutual knowing, the material from which intimacy is built, the shared history that gives a relationship texture and depth. You share things about yourself, your hopes, your concerns, your vulnerabilities, your past, your present struggles and future ambitions, because sharing is how human beings build the particular kind of closeness that makes life feel genuinely inhabited and genuinely witnessed. For the person who plays dirty, information is not content, it is inventory. Every piece of information you share with them, every vulnerability disclosed, every preference expressed, every fear revealed, every ambition stated, every relationship dynamic described, is catalogued, not necessarily consciously, not necessarily with explicit planning, but it is retained with a specificity and a quality of attention that exceeds what a casual or even a close friend typically applies, because it is retained not as memory, but as resource. And when the conditions are right, when the interests of this person and your interests diverge significantly enough that the benefit of exploiting the resource outweighs the cost of the relationship, the inventory is converted into instruments. The specific quality of this exploitation, the use of your own confidences as the material for the strategy against you, produces a distinctive and particularly painful kind of violation. It is not just that you were wronged, it is that the very intimacy of the relationship was weaponized. The things you shared because you trusted became the things used against you precisely because you trusted. And the wound has this recursive quality to it. Every moment of genuine sharing, every disclosure, every time you chose to be fully honest with this person now lives in your memory with a different quality. Reread through the lens of how it was ultimately used, with the question hanging over each one. Did they already know in that moment that this would eventually be used? Were they already cataloguing it even then? The answer to that question is not always clear, and it matters less than you might think. Whether the cataloguing was conscious from the beginning or became conscious only when the opportunity to exploit arrived, the behavioral result was the same. And what the question really reveals, the thing that sits beneath it, is the desire to understand when the real person began and the performance ended. The desire for a clear line between the genuine and the strategic, the warm and the calculating. The uncomfortable truth is that for people who operate this way, these things are not as clearly separated as you need them to be. The warmth and the calculation exist simultaneously. The genuine connection and the strategic accumulation of useful information occur in the same conversation. This person was both real in their warmth and real in their strategy. Both happened at once, and the inability to find the clean line is not your failure of perception. It is the actual complexity of how this kind of person operates. Understanding this complexity, sitting with it rather than trying to resolve it into a simpler narrative, is one of the most important acts of intelligence available to you in this situation. Because the simple narratives, either they were entirely fake from the beginning or there was genuine connection that was eventually corrupted, are both less accurate than the complex truth, and both, in their inaccuracy, produce conclusions that do not serve you. The first narrative makes you feel like a complete fool who missed obvious deception, which is not accurate and which reinforces a kind of shame that closes you off from appropriate future openness. The second narrative keeps the hope alive that if you could just get the person to acknowledge what they did, the genuine connection might be restored, which is not accurate and which keeps you emotionally invested in someone who has demonstrated clearly who they are when their interests are at stake. The complex truth is this: this person was real in their warmth and strategic in their information gathering simultaneously, and when the interests of their strategy and the demands of their warmth came into genuine conflict, the strategy won. That is who they are. That is a complete portrait. It requires nothing more of you than the willingness to see it clearly, without the overlay of either shame or hope that distorts it. See it, own the clarity, and then move forward from that clarity into the 10 principles that tell you exactly what to do with it. The first principle, and I want you to feel the full weight of what I am about to tell you, because the first principle is both the simplest sounding and the hardest to actually execute, is total silence after the betrayal, not modified silence, not strategic silence that you deploy publicly while processing loudly in your inner circle, not the kind of quiet that is really just delayed reactivity, holding itself back until a more opportune moment to explode. Total silence, the complete suspension of outward response in any form through any channel to any audience until the conditions that support effective response actually exist. Understanding why this is so difficult is the first step to actually being able to do it. Because if you understand precisely what you are working against when you try to hold silence in the immediate aftermath of a betrayal, you can work with that understanding rather than simply wrestling against an impulse you cannot fully see. What you are working against is your own nervous system. When someone plays dirty with you, when a betrayal occurs, your body does not process it as a social event requiring strategic navigation. It processes it as a threat, a genuine, immediate, dangerous threat to your security, your position, your social bonds, your sense of safety in your environment. And in response to that perceived threat, your nervous system activates the same cascade that it evolved to activate in response to physical danger. Adrenaline flooding your bloodstream, cortisol spiking and sustaining for an extended period, attention narrowing sharply onto the threat and away from everything peripheral to it, and a powerful, urgent, nearly irresistible physiological compulsion to act, to do something, anything, now, to address the threat and restore the sense of safety that the threat has disrupted. This response is millions of years old. It is exquisitely designed for the kind of threats that shaped human evolution, the immediate physical dangers that required rapid, decisive response without time for deliberation. It is not designed for the kind of threat that a complex social betrayal represents. In fact, for that kind of threat, the evolutionary response is almost perfectly counterproductive, because the response that immediate danger requires, rapid, decisive, emotionally charged action, is precisely the response that complex social conflict punishes most severely. Let me show you why. Think about what happens when you confront a person who has played dirty with you in the acute phase of the betrayal. In the hours or days immediately following discovery, before the biochemical flood has receded, before your analytical intelligence has been restored to full function by the return of neurological homeostasis. In that state, the confrontation will have several characteristic features. Your emotional expression will be high, because the emotional charge is genuinely high and it will be visible, because the capacity for strategic regulation of emotional display requires exactly the kind of cognitive resources that have been temporarily diverted to the threat response. Your account of what happened will be organized around the wound, around the specific pain of what was done and the specific injustice of having been treated this way, rather than around a strategic assessment of what you need the confrontation to achieve and how to get there. And here is what the person who wronged you does with all of that. They receive, in real time and in vivid detail, the complete picture of your emotional state. They learn precisely how deep the wound is, what it cost you, where you were most hurt, which specific elements of the betrayal were most impactful. They receive, presented by you directly, the full intelligence package about your vulnerabilities that they can then use in the next phase of the interaction. And they use it immediately, because this is what they are good at. They reframe. They minimize the action and amplify the reaction. Your emotional display becomes the story. Your pain becomes evidence of instability or overreaction or some personal dysfunction that explains why you are responding with this level of intensity to something that, in their telling, was either much less significant than you are making it, or was actually a reasonable response to something you did, or was a misunderstanding that any reasonable person would have already resolved. The confrontation is now about your emotional state. You are on the defensive. You are explaining and justifying your reaction instead of holding them accountable for their action. And they, calm, composed, slightly aggrieved by the whole unnecessary scene, are positioned as the adult in the room, while you are positioned as the person with the problem. Witnesses, if there are any, receive this impression. The narrative has been established. And you have been maneuvered from the position of the wronged party, seeking accountability, into the position of the unstable person who needs to get themselves under control. You have seen this happen. This reversal, this specific demoralizing flip from seeking accountability to defending sanity, is not accidental. It is a move, one of the oldest and most effective moves in the playbook of someone who has played dirty and is managing the consequences of being called on it. And the only thing that prevents it is the thing that prevents you from giving them the raw emotional reaction they are prepared to receive and neutralize. Silence, complete and sustained silence, until you have something better than raw emotion to bring to the encounter. Silence does three things simultaneously that no reactive response can do. First, it withholds the primary intelligence the other person needs to manage their next move. When you do not react, they do not know, what you are planning, how deep the wound is, or whether you have already made moves they are not aware of. That uncertainty, that inability to read your position, is a form of power in itself. It shifts the information asymmetry, even slightly, away from the position they enjoyed during the betrayal and back towards something closer to equilibrium. Second, silence creates the neurological space for your own analytical intelligence to come back online. The biochemical flood of the threat response is temporary. Cortisol peaks and recedes. Adrenaline metabolizes. The narrowed, crisis-focused attention begins to broaden back to its normal range. Given sufficient time, and this varies enormously by person and by the specific nature of the betrayal, but it is always more than a few hours and usually more than a few days, the quality of your thinking about the situation shifts from reactive to analytical, from inside the wound to above it, from looking at the piece that was moved to looking at the whole board. And from that broader perspective, decisions that were impossible in the acute phase become possible. Moves that were invisible when you were inside the pain become visible when you can see the full landscape. Third, and this is the dimension that most people do not anticipate, the silence builds something in you, something structural. Every moment that you hold the silence, every moment that you choose consciously and deliberately not to release the urgency of the wound into premature action, you are practicing the single most important discipline available to anyone navigating complex conflict. You are demonstrating to yourself, at the moment when it costs you the most to do so, that you are capable of choosing your response rather than being controlled by your reaction. That you can sit with acute discomfort without being driven by it into action. that serves the discomfort rather than your actual interests. That the loudest feeling is not always the most accurate signal about what to do. This demonstration, made at the moment of greatest difficulty, builds a kind of internal confidence that nothing else produces, the lived knowledge that you are genuinely capable of strategic discipline when it matters most. And every subsequent principle in this framework is built on that foundation. If you cannot hold the silence, nothing that follows will be executed with sufficient discipline to be effective. If you can, everything that follows becomes possible. The silence is not the end. It is not a permanent position. It is the threshold, the discipline that must be held long enough for the conditions of effective response to exist. How long is long enough? There is no universal answer. The measure is not time. It is the quality of your internal state when you consider the situation. Can you look at the full picture? The person who wronged you, the social environment, the information available, the possible moves and their likely consequences, with something approaching calm, analytical clarity. Can you think about what happened without the quality of your thinking being distorted by the urgency of the pain? Can you distinguish between what you want to do, the emotionally satisfying move, and what will actually serve your interests over the period of time that matters? When you can genuinely do all three of these things, you are ready to move to the second principle. Until then, silence. Complete, sustained, deliberate silence. Let it be the first move in a game where you now know the rules. The second principle flows directly from the silence and transforms it from mere restraint into something actively powerful. It is observation without disclosure, and the distinction between these two elements is where the silence first becomes strategic rather than simply cautious. Observation without disclosure is built on a foundational recognition that the silence you are maintaining externally does not mean stillness internally. While the surface of your behavior remains consistent, professional, functional, composed, the entirety of your perceptual and analytical capacity is engaged actively and systematically in gathering the most accurate picture possible of the terrain you are operating in. You are in collection mode. Every interaction, every social pattern, every behavioral signal in the environment is a data point that contributes to the map you are building. And the map, accurate, evidence-based, unclouded by wishful thinking, is the foundation on which every subsequent strategic decision rests. Let me be precise about what observation without disclosure means in practice, because there are important distinctions that determine whether it is effective or whether it inadvertently compromises your position. It does not mean acting normal while you are internally in crisis and simply hoping no one notices the performance. That is not observation. That is management of appearance without strategic use of the information the situation is producing. And it is exhausting to maintain because it requires enormous energy to suppress the authentic expression of a genuine internal state without that energy producing any strategic return. What it actually means is considerably more active and considerably more interesting. It means choosing deliberately, as an act of strategic intelligence, to maintain the surface of your normal behavioral patterns in the environment while directing your attention beneath that surface toward the systematic observation of everything the environment is producing. The surface maintenance is not suppression. It is the deployment of a calibrated exterior, a topic we will address more fully in a later principle, that gives you continued access to the information environment without signaling to that environment that you are in observation mode. Because here is the crucial thing about observation: it only works if the people being observed do not know they are being observed. A person who knows they are being watched modifies their behavior toward what they want to project rather than what they naturally are. A person who believes the situation is relatively normal, who believes you are still operating on the old assumptions, still in the old frame of understanding about the relationship, reveals themselves through the natural, unmanaged expression of their actual current state, and what they reveal through that natural expression is worth more than anything you could extract through direct inquiry. So you watch, with the particular quality of attention that is calm and methodical rather than anxious and hypervigilant. There is an important difference between these two qualities. And the distinction matters both for the accuracy of what you perceive and for the sustainability of the observation over the potentially extended period during which it needs to occur. Anxious hypervigilance exhausts and distorts. It reads threat into ambiguity, pattern into randomness, significance into noise, and produces a picture of the environment that is more paranoid than accurate. Calm, methodical observation rests comfortably on what is actually there. It notices, catalogues, considers, and reserves interpretation until sufficient data exists to support it. This second quality is the one you are cultivating. It is the one that produces usable intelligence. What are you watching for? Everything. But let me give you the specific categories of observation that are most consistently informative in the aftermath of a betrayal. The behavior of the person who wronged you is the first and most direct source of intelligence. Watch for the specific changes in their behavioral patterns that indicate their current internal state and their current strategic posture. Do they seek you out with unusual frequency? If so, what is the quality of the contact? Is it genuinely warm, or does it have the slightly effortful quality of contact that is being made for strategic rather than authentic reasons? Does it feel like an old friend reaching out because they missed you, or does it feel like a politician working a room? The distinction is often subtle, but rarely invisible to someone paying careful attention. Alternatively, do they withdraw from you significantly? If so, what does the specific character of the withdrawal tell you? Withdrawal from someone you wronged can indicate several very different things. Confidence that the wrong was successful and requires no management, discomfort with the proximity of someone who knows what they did, or deliberate strategic distance designed to create the impression of normalcy while managing the consequences of the situation through channels you are not directly aware of. Distinguishing between these possibilities requires additional observation, watching how they engage with other people in the environment, whether their general functioning seems relaxed or subtly anxious, whether they are making any moves in the broader social landscape that seem connected to managing the consequences of what they did. The narrative management move is particularly important to watch for and to detect early, because it represents the most significant threat to your position in the period following a betrayal. This move, the preemptive shaping of the information environment in ways that establish a favorable version of events before you have been able to establish your own, is one that sophisticated people who play dirty execute often without their targets realizing it is happening. It is subtle. It does not involve obviously false statements. Those are too risky, too easily contradicted. It involves the selective disclosure of true facts, framed in a way that tells the story the narrator wants told. An emphasis here, an omission there, a particular framing of your response to what happened that, without explicitly calling you unstable, creates the background impression of someone who is difficult to reason with, someone whose account of situations needs to be received with some allowance for their tendency toward emotional intensity or sensitivity or unreasonableness. How do you detect this move when it is being made? Through the secondary signals it produces in the social environment. Watch for subtle shifts in the quality of engagement that people who are adjacent to the situation extend toward you. Not dramatic changes. Dramatic changes are too obvious, too attributable, and usually indicate someone who has made their position clear through the less subtle channel of simply telling you what they think. Subtle changes. The slightly different quality of attention someone pays you when they are evaluating what they are seeing against what they have been told. The particular calibration of warmth from someone who was previously fully warm, still basically friendly, but with a slight, barely perceptible additional carefulness. The quality of listening from someone who seems to be, alongside hearing what you are saying, also assessing it against some other version of the situation that exists in their mind. These signals are real. They are not your imagination if you're observing calmly rather than anxiously, and they tell you something critical. They tell you where the narrative has already reached. They tell you which parts of the social environment have been, to some degree, shaped by the other person's version of events. This is intelligence you need, not to become defensive or distressed by it, but to factor it into your own eventual decisions about when and how and to whom you address the situation. Knowing that certain people in the environment have received a partial or shaped version of events tells you that those people need a different kind of engagement than people who are arriving at the situation without that prior framing. It tells you the order in which you address different parts of the landscape and the specific information each person needs to receive in order to be restored to accurate understanding. You are building a map of the terrain, a real, accurate, evidence-based map that includes not just the physical geography, who is where, what the stated positions are, but the deeper topography of loyalty, of interest, of genuine versus performed alignment, of real versus strategic warmth. This map takes time to build accurately. Every day of patient observation adds detail that makes the map more precise, and your eventual decisions more capable of producing the results you actually want. Do not rush it. The map is the asset. The clarity it provides is worth every day it takes to develop it. The third principle is where the strategy becomes active in a new and more complex way. Where the first two principles were primarily about discipline and collection, holding silence, observing without disclosure, gathering intelligence, the third principle introduces the element of deliberate action. Not confrontational action, not reactive action, but the precise, targeted, controlled action of someone who understands that in a complex social conflict, information is a resource that can be managed, directed, and deployed to serve specific strategic purposes. The third principle is the controlled release of limited information. And the key word, the word that carries all the weight of the principle, is controlled, not restrained, which implies simply less than the maximum. Controlled, which implies precise determination of what goes where and why. Let me begin with the failure mode, because the failure mode is where most people who have managed the earlier principles with genuine discipline come unstuck. The failure mode is this: you have held the silence, you have observed carefully, you have built a reasonably accurate picture of the situation, and then, because you are human, because human beings process experience through language and through relationship, because carrying something this heavy in complete isolation is genuinely costly, you begin to talk. Not with clear strategic intent about which specific piece of information serves what specific purpose, when shared with which specific person. You talk because the weight needs to be shared, and talking is the most natural, most available mechanism for sharing it. You talk to your close friend who is also in the shared environment, to your colleague who knows all the relevant people, to the family member who has been watching this situation with concern, and whose emotional support feels genuinely necessary and genuinely available. You talk more than the situation requires, earlier than the situation supports, with more people than the situation justifies. And the information, the private intelligence that was your most valuable asset, begins to escape into the social ecosystem. And once information enters the social ecosystem, you have lost direct control of it. It becomes a resource that each person who receives it can use, share, or withhold according to their own values, relationships, and interests, not according to yours. Some people will be genuinely discreet and protective of what you share. But even the most well-intentioned people sometimes mention things to people they consider safe, who mention them to people they consider safe, and within 2 or 3 such transmissions, a piece of information that you shared in the strictest confidence has traveled to a destination you would never have chosen for it, including, potentially, to the person who wronged you. When the person who wronged you receives intelligence about your internal state, your assessments, your plans, and your grievances through secondary channels, before you have chosen to share any of this directly, they gain several things that are catastrophic to your position. They know what you know. They know, at least approximately, what you are feeling and thinking about the situation. They have time to prepare a response to information you were not ready to share yet. They may be able to make preemptive moves, establishing their narrative, shoring up key relationships, preparing their defense, before you are ready to engage the situation directly. The element of surprise, which Machiavelli correctly identified as often the decisive advantage in conflict, is gone entirely. And you are now responding to a situation where the other person has been prepared for your move, rather than making your move from a position of relative information advantage. This is why controlled matters more than the simple instruction to limit your sharing. Controlled means that before any piece of information about the situation leaves your direct possession, you answer 3 questions with genuine rigor, rather than with the partial, hope-inflected rigor that the desire to share tends to produce. The first question: what is the actual purpose of sharing this specific piece of information with this specific person at this specific moment? Is there a genuine strategic purpose? Does sharing this advance your position in some specific way, give you access to resources or perspectives you genuinely need, or serve as a necessary step in a process you have clearly thought through? Or is the purpose emotional? Do you need to be heard, to be witnessed, to have the weight acknowledged by someone whose understanding matters to you? Both of these are real needs, but they require different channels. Emotional processing belongs in a sealed context, with a therapist, with a person who has absolutely no connection to the social environment where the situation is playing out, in a journal that no one else reads. It does not belong in the strategic information environment, where the need to be heard will override the discipline of precision, and you will share more than the situation supports. If you cannot identify a specific, genuine strategic purpose for sharing a specific piece of information, the information stays with you, not forever, but until you can identify the purpose clearly. The inability to identify a purpose now is information itself. It tells you that you are not yet ready to share strategically, that you are still primarily in emotional processing mode, and that the right environment for this information is not the strategic one. The second question: what is the full realistic universe of people this information could reach once it leaves your direct control? Not just the person you are sharing with. Everyone who is socially connected to that person, including the connections you are not fully aware of. Everyone who might be present in an environment where this person mentions it, even casually. Everyone in the network of relationships that radiates out from any single disclosure. The social geography of information transmission is almost always larger than it appears, and the paths information takes are almost always less predictable than they seem. Map the universe honestly, including the most uncomfortable possibilities, before you share. If the full realistic universe of potential recipients includes the person who wronged you, or anyone who has a primary loyalty to that person, or anyone whose discretion you have not had the opportunity to verify under conditions where discretion actually costs something, the information stays with you. The third question: if this information reaches the person who wronged me in the worst possible form, most distorted, most out of context, most emotionally amplified, what does that cost me? And what moves does it enable them to make that they cannot currently make? This question forces honest assessment of the actual strategic risk of sharing, not the theoretical risk in the best-case scenario, but the real risk in the realistic worst case. Some information, if it reaches the wrong person, costs you relatively little. It might be mildly embarrassing or slightly compromising, but does not fundamentally change the strategic landscape. Other information, if it reaches the wrong person, gives them exactly what they need to neutralize your next move, preempt your position, or turn the situation in ways that are genuinely damaging to your interests. To know which category you are dealing with before you share. If the worst case is genuinely costly, the information stays with you. Apply all 3 of these questions to every potential disclosure. They are not a bureaucratic checklist. They are the discipline of a person who understands that in a situation where someone has already demonstrated willingness to play dirty, information control is one of the most consequential capabilities you have. The temporary relief of sharing before you are strategically ready costs you something that the sharing cannot compensate for. Every premature disclosure is a trade of long-term position for short-term emotional regulation. Make the trade explicitly with awareness rather than by default. There is a sophisticated and specifically Machiavellian application of the controlled release principle that deserves its own discussion. The strategic test. This is the deliberate, precise use of the controlled release framework, not just to protect your information, but to gather intelligence about the reliability of specific people in your environment. Here is how it works, and it requires careful execution to be effective without being manipulative. You identify a piece of information, not your most sensitive intelligence, but something that is distinctive enough to be traceable if it travels and real enough to be genuinely shared rather than obviously constructed. And you share it with a specific person whose loyalty and discretion you are uncertain about. You tell no one else the same piece. And then you observe. Does the information stay contained? Does it emerge in a conversation with someone you did not tell, in a form that suggests it came from the person you shared it with? Does it come back to you altered in ways that reveal the specific perspective of an intermediary it passed through? The pattern of how the test piece travels tells you more about the reliability of that person than years of benign, unchallenged interaction could. It tells you definitively whether this person exercises discretion when discretion costs them nothing, the relatively easy test, or whether they will share what you told them in confidence when an opportunity to share it arises. This is not the same as asking whether they would share it if someone specifically asked. It is asking whether they share it simply because the opportunity presents itself and they feel safe doing so. That is the real test of discretion, because most betrayals of confidence happen not through calculated disclosure, but through the casual sharing that happens when discretion requires no active effort to maintain. Run the test with multiple people at different levels of social proximity to the situation. Each result adds a data point to your map of the environment's actual reliability landscape. And from that map, you build the verified inner circle that the seventh principle, alliance discipline, requires. You are not doing this in order to catch people or punish them. You are doing it in order to know, with evidence-based confidence, rather than hopeful assumption, who can actually be trusted with what. Control the information, build the map, and proceed. The fourth principle strikes at the place where most people remain most vulnerable long after the external situation has been substantially resolved. It is the principle that determines whether the earlier moves create genuine freedom or merely temporary relief. It is the severing of the emotional contract, and it requires a more extended treatment than its apparent simplicity might suggest. Because the emotional contract is not a simple thing to sever, and the attempt to sever it through force or performance, rather than through genuine internal work, almost always fails in ways that are costly. What is the emotional contract? It is the implicit agreement that governs the terms of mutual obligation in a relationship, any relationship. It is never written. It is rarely spoken in direct terms, but it exists with real force in the shared understanding of both parties about what the relationship requires of them. In a professional relationship, it might be mutual good faith in collaboration, honest representation of interests, appropriate sharing of credit and acknowledgement of contribution. In a personal relationship, it might be reciprocal investment, reasonable confidentiality, the basic assumption that information shared in the context of the relationship is used only within the terms of that relationship. In a friendship, it might be genuine loyalty when loyalty is inconvenient, the willingness to prioritize the friend's well-being over the speaker's social comfort in specific circumstances. These contracts are real, and they structure behavior. When both parties are operating within them, the relationship functions. When one party breaks the contract, when they make a unilateral decision to act in ways that violate the foundational terms of the mutual agreement, the contract is destroyed. It cannot be partially violated and still maintained. The violation changes what the contract was, retroactively as well as prospectively, in a way that cannot be undone. The relationship that existed prior to the violation was a relationship between two parties who were both operating under the agreement. That relationship no longer exists. What exists after the violation is different, whether it is a relationship of recovery, a relationship of strategic management, or no relationship at all depends on circumstances, but it is not what it was before. The old contract is dead. This is simply the fact of the situation. The contract that governed your relationship with the person who wronged you is dead. They chose to end it through their actions, in the moment when they prioritized their own advantage over the terms of what you had implicitly agreed to together. And the accurate, intelligent response to that death is to recognize it as what it is, fully, without qualification, and to stop behaving as though the contract still exists in any form that requires maintenance from your side. But most people do not do this, not because they are unable to understand it intellectually, The understanding comes relatively easily, because the emotional architecture of the relationship was real, and the death of the contract does not automatically dismantle that emotional architecture. The feelings that were built up over the course of the relationship, the care, the investment, the sense of connection, the hope for a particular future, do not evaporate because the contract was broken. They persist, and they express themselves in the internal life of the person who was wronged through the continued attempt to do something about the dead contract that logic says is over. The most common form of this continued attempt is the replay, the mental rehearsal of conversations that might have gone differently. The reconstruction of the moment of betrayal run through multiple alternative timelines in which different choices by either party produce different outcomes. The composition and recomposition of the confrontation that would, in the private theater of your own mind, result in the acknowledgement, the accountability, the genuine recognition from the person who wronged you that what they did was real and wrong and caused genuine harm. The rehearsal feels productive. It feels like processing, like working through, like approaching resolution, because it is active and engaged and uses the language of real resolution. But what it is actually doing is maintaining the emotional investment in a relationship that no longer exists, in the form that warrants that investment. Every hour spent in the replay is an hour in which the person who wronged you retains centrality, retains the position of someone whose opinion, whose acknowledgement, whose revised understanding of the situation is worth your time and attention and emotional energy. And that centrality, maintained through your own internal activity, gives them something they did not earn and do not deserve, continued influence over your internal state. Not through any action of their own. They may not even be thinking about you at all. Through your ongoing orientation toward a resolution that they are not interested in providing, and that, in the honest assessment of who they have revealed themselves to be, they are not capable of providing in the form that would actually serve you. The severing of the emotional contract means the genuine dissolution of this orientation, not through suppression of the feelings. Suppression buries without resolving, and buried things resurface with compounded force at inconvenient moments. Not through hatred. Hatred is also a form of investment, a way of maintaining centrality for someone who should become peripheral, a relationship of negative engagement that is still a relationship. But through the specific process of redirecting the energy and attention that have been flowing toward the dead contract and investing them in something that is alive, that is present, that actually benefits from the attention and energy you are giving to the replay. Every time you find yourself in the mental loop, every time the replay begins, every time you catch yourself composing the conversation, every time you find yourself orienting toward the absent acknowledgement that the other person will never spontaneously provide, you interrupt it, not with force, not with self-criticism about the fact that you are doing it again, with simple, gentle, deliberate redirection. What is alive right now that deserves your attention? What project, what relationship, what dimension of your own development and your own goals is available to receive the quality of engagement that the replay has been consuming? What is actually present that you can actually affect, rather than what is absent and over and impossible to change? This redirection, practiced consistently over time, and consistency over time is the only thing that actually works, there is no shortcut to it, accomplishes something that no confrontation, no acknowledgement from the other person, no external resolution of the situation could provide. It restores you to the center of your own story. In the ongoing processing of the betrayal, the person who wronged you has occupied the central position. Their actions, their motivations, their choices, their potential for acknowledgement and accountability have been the organizing principle around which your internal narrative has been structured. The redirection dismantles this structure, gradually and then completely, and rebuilds your internal architecture around the person and the life and the goals that actually deserve to be at its center, which is you, which is your actual, present, continuing life. When the emotional contract is genuinely severed, not declared severed, but actually severed, which is the product of sustained redirection over sufficient time rather than a single decision, the liberation that follows is significant and specific. The fear of the other person's judgment dissolves. the need for their acknowledgement of the wrong evaporates. The particular kind of vigilance that maintained your orientation toward them, the part of your attention that was always tracking, always wondering, always relating your own state to theirs, simply ceases to function. They become, in your experience of them, exactly what they should have been from the moment the betrayal revealed who they are, someone who happened in your life, who revealed important information about themselves through how they chose to act, whose actions cost you something real, and whose further opinion, judgment or acknowledgement of any kind, is simply not relevant to anything that matters to you going forward. From this place, and only from this place, the subsequent principles can be executed with their full power. Because every principle that follows requires a degree of genuine composure, genuine forward orientation, genuine freedom from emotional reactivity, that is only actually available to someone who has done this work. You can manage the appearance of these qualities from a place of ongoing emotional investment in the dead contract. But managing appearances is expensive and ultimately unsustainable, and the managed appearance will crack at the moment of highest pressure, which is precisely the moment when you most need the real thing. Do the internal work. It is the most important work in this entire framework. The fifth principle is the one that most directly challenges the urgency that a significant wound generates, and that urgency is real. When something significant has been done to you, the desire to respond, to act, to restore the situation to its correct moral order now is not weakness. It is not irrationality. It is the natural, human, entirely appropriate response to violation. The problem is not the urgency itself. The problem is acting on it before the conditions that support effective action actually exist. The fifth principle is the mastery of timing, the discipline of waiting not until you feel ready to act, but until the conditions are genuinely right for action to produce the result you actually want. This distinction between feeling ready and conditions being right is the core of what timing mastery means. And it is a distinction that the urgency of a wound consistently collapses, because when you are in pain, the feeling of readiness, the emotional state in which acting would feel satisfying, in which the urgency would find its outlet, arrives long before the external conditions that would make the action effective actually exist. Let me make this concrete with two parallel scenarios that illustrate the difference that timing makes even when the action taken is essentially the same. Consider two people, we can call them A and B, who have been wronged in identical ways by the same type of person. Both of them, once they have processed the initial shock, decide that they need to address what happened directly. The difference between them is solely when they act. Person A acts in the first week. The wound is raw. The anger is close to the surface. The full picture of the situation is still emerging. They have not had time to observe carefully, to map the social landscape, to understand the full architecture of who is where and what resources and positions each relevant party currently holds. They go into the confrontation with emotional charge that is visible and high, with incomplete information about the terrain, and with a specific desired outcome, accountability and acknowledgement, that the confrontation, given the other person's demonstrated character, was never going to produce. What actually happens, the reversal described earlier, their emotional state becomes the story. The other person manages the confrontation skillfully, presenting as the reasonable party, bewildered by the intensity of the reaction. A leaves the confrontation feeling humiliated and in a worse position than before they acted, because now they have had the confrontation, it went badly, and they are dealing with the consequences of a failed move on top of the original wound. Person B waits. They hold the silence of the first principle while observing systematically. They do the internal work of the fourth principle, severing the emotional contract sufficiently that their composure is genuine rather than managed. They build a clear, evidence-based picture of the social terrain. They gather intelligence about who has received what version of the situation and what positions the relevant parties have settled into. And as they wait, the situation develops. The person who wronged them, emboldened by the absence of the expected confrontation, possibly feeling that they have successfully managed the situation, makes additional moves. Some of these additional moves create new vulnerabilities. Some of them reveal additional information that was not available in the first week. Some of them shift the positions of people in the shared environment in ways that change the strategic landscape. The person who wronged them also over time relaxes. The acute vigilance of the first weeks, the careful management of their own behavior and presentation that they exercised while they were anticipating a response, gives way to the more natural, less carefully managed behavior of someone who believes the situation has been resolved in their favor. 3 months later, Person B has a fundamentally different array of options than Person A had in week 1. They have better information, they have a more accurate and detailed map of the terrain, they have a more stable, less reactive emotional foundation. They have identified the specific action, not necessarily a confrontation, possibly something quite different that will most effectively serve their actual interests, and they have the additional intelligence generated by the other person's own subsequent behavior, some of which has created vulnerabilities or contradictions in their position that simply did not exist in week 1. When Person B acts, they act from a position of genuine preparation. The precision and effectiveness of the action are categorically different from what Person A achieved, or failed to achieve, by acting 7 weeks earlier. The timing was the difference, not between courage and cowardice, between impatience and precision, between the emotionally satisfying move and the strategically effective one. How do you practice the mastery of timing when you are sitting inside the urgency of a wound that demands immediate response? You practice it the same way you practice any discipline that runs counter to a strong impulse, by developing a clear enough understanding of why the discipline serves you, that the understanding becomes stronger than the impulse. You rehearse the parallel scenarios. You identify specifically what you would lose by acting now, what intelligence you would be acting without, what composure you would be sacrificing, what vulnerabilities in your position the precipitous action would create. You make the cost of acting too early as real and as concrete in your mind as the pain of the wound that is pushing you toward it. And you build forward during the wait. Every day of waiting is also a day in which you are building your position, your composure, your clarity, your capability. Every day that passes during which you have held the silence and maintained the observation and done the internal work is a day that makes the eventual action more powerful, and the position from which you take it more secure. The waiting is not empty time, it is preparation time. And preparation, applied consistently over sufficient time, is the most decisive advantage available in any complex conflict. Wait, prepare, move when the conditions are right. The 6th principle is one of the most sophisticated in the entire framework, and it is the one that most directly addresses the social performance dimension of navigating a complex conflict, not as deception, but as the deliberate and strategic management of what is visible about your internal state to people who have not earned the right to that information. It is the construction of an alternate surface, the composed, forward-focused, strategically unreadable exterior that you maintain in the shared environment, while your actual state, your actual planning, your actual intelligence gathering, your actual building, operates entirely beneath it. Let me immediately address the philosophical objection that this principle reliably triggers, because the objection is legitimate and deserves direct engagement rather than dismissal. The objection is that this principle asks you to be inauthentic, to present a version of yourself to the world that does not accurately reflect your actual internal experience, and that this inauthenticity is both ethically problematic and psychologically damaging. Here is the precise response. Authenticity, correctly understood, does not mean that every internal state must be immediately and fully visible to every person in every context. Authenticity means being genuinely yourself, being true to your own values, your own commitments, your own understanding of what matters, in the relationships and contexts that deserve your genuine self. It means not performing a version of yourself that contradicts your actual values for the purpose of creating a misleading impression that serves an agenda. What it does not mean is that your most private, most strategic, most carefully developed intelligence must be broadcast to everyone who might benefit from access to it, including people who have already demonstrated willingness to use access to your inner life as a resource for their own advantage. Your internal experience, your actual assessment of the situation, your actual strategic planning, your actual state of mind in this period, is your most private resource. It is your intelligence. And the decision about who has access to your intelligence is not an authenticity question. It is a trust and safety question. You share your genuine self fully with people who have demonstrated, through the evidence of their behavior, that they deserve that access. With everyone else, including the person who wronged you, and everyone whose relationship with them makes them an unreliable recipient of your private intelligence, you maintain the surface. Not because you are deceiving them, because they have not earned the access that real self-disclosure represents. So what is the alternate surface? It is the exterior presentation of composure, functional presence, and forward focus. It is showing up in the shared environment in a way that fulfills your legitimate obligations in that environment, your professional responsibilities, your social commitments, your relational obligations to people who have nothing to do with the conflict, without the specific behavioral signals that would tell an observant person that you are managing a significant wound. Not cold. Coldness is visible, readable, and discloses your internal state as effectively as obvious distress does, just in a different register. Composed. Present. Appropriately warm where appropriate warmth is warranted. Focused on the work, the projects, the goals, and the people in the environment that are genuinely part of your forward trajectory. This exterior, when it is genuine, when it is the natural expression of the internal work you have done through the earlier principles rather than a performance maintained through exhausting suppression, produces a specific and powerful effect on the social environment. It denies the person who wronged you the primary data source they need to manage their next move. When you are visibly struggling, visibly derailed, visibly preoccupied with the wound, that visibility confirms for them that what they did worked. It validates the strategic choice they made. It tells them that they accurately assessed your vulnerabilities and exploited them effectively. And a person who feels this confirmation is emboldened. They are more confident in their position, more comfortable in the social environment, less likely to make the errors of overconfidence that your silence and observation are waiting to catch. When you appear unmoved, not cold, not hostile, not performing happiness, but simply composedly present and forward-focused, something very different happens in the person who wronged you. A doubt enters, a question they cannot cleanly answer. Did it land the way they expected? Do they know something they are not showing? Are they further along in some response than it appears? Are they operating with a strategic clarity and direction that suggests the situation is not as settled in my favor as I thought? This uncertainty, this inability to read your position with confidence, is genuinely uncomfortable for people who operate strategically. They are accustomed to reading the people around them. Their strategy depends on it, and a person who is unreadable is a person about whom they cannot make confident calculations. That uncertainty is the first crack in the confidence that the betrayal created in them. Let that crack develop. Your composure creates the conditions for it. Maintain it. The sixth principle extends beyond the immediate social environment into the broader domain of your own life. While the person who wronged you may be anticipating, perhaps counting on, a period of derailment in your trajectory, you use this period to advance, not as performance for their benefit, as the genuine expression of the internal work the fourth principle created. You have redirected the energy from the dead emotional contract toward the living dimensions of your actual goals and projects. Now you invest that redirected energy visibly, consistently, and with genuine commitment. The work gets better. The projects move forward. The relationships that are genuinely alive and generative deepen. The skills you have been building compound toward real expertise. Over weeks and months, this accumulation becomes visible. It becomes a simple, undeniable fact about your trajectory that stands in the environment as the most effective counter-narrative to anything that has been said about you, not as an argument that needs to be defended or a position that needs to be justified, but as simple, visible evidence of a person who is moving forward with clarity and capability. This is the earliest expression of the eighth principle, the excellence of undeniable results, that we will address more fully shortly. Note how it begins here, in the sixth principle, as the natural extension of composure into genuine forward building. The principles are not independent. They compound each other, each one building on and amplifying the others. The seventh principle addresses one of the most complex and nuanced dimensions of navigating the aftermath of a betrayal: the management of your alliances, and the complexity here is real. Because this is the domain where the failure modes are most tempting, and where even people who have executed the earlier principles with genuine sophistication most commonly go wrong. The temptation toward oversharing is, as we have discussed, the most immediate and most common failure mode. The desire to be heard, to have the weight witnessed, to build a coalition of people who understand what happened and stand with you. This desire is entirely natural and not without genuine value. There is real sustaining power in being genuinely witnessed. The problem is the specific conditions under which that witnessing occurs and what it costs you strategically. When you share widely and without strategic discipline, you do not merely lose information control. You organize the social environment around a narrative. Your narrative, yes, but a narrative that is necessarily simpler than the full reality of a complex human situation. And a social coalition organized around a simplified narrative is inherently unstable, because reality is not simple and it will assert its complexity over time. The people who joined the coalition based on the clean version of the story will encounter dimensions of the situation that the clean version did not account for. The humanity of the person who wronged you, the genuine relationships they have with people who also have genuine relationships with you, the specific circumstances that, while they do not justify what they did, complicate the straightforward moral assessment that the clean narrative supported. As these complications emerge, the coalition frays. Members revise their positions silently in ways they may not tell you directly. Others feel invested enough in the original version that they resist the complexity and maintain a position that is increasingly out of touch with what is actually happening. Neither of these outcomes serves you. Both of them add a layer of social complexity to an already complex situation. The temptation toward isolation is the opposite failure mode, but its consequences are equally significant. When someone has been burned, the instinct to close off, to trust no one in proximity to the situation, to process everything internally, to present a completely self-sufficient front to the entire environment is understandable. It is protective, and it is also, in its extremity, a strategic mistake. Because the person who is genuinely isolated, who has no verified inner circle, no genuine alliance of people who can provide real perspective, real support, real collaborative intelligence, is also a person who is operating on the least possible information about an environment they are navigating under genuinely complex conditions. You need input from people who are genuinely in your corner. You need perspective that the isolation of your own vantage point cannot provide. You need the specific kind of support that says, "I know what is true about you, I know what actually happened, and I will stand by that truth when it matters." You cannot build the life the eighth principle calls for without some genuine human collaboration in the building. Isolation protects the information and forfeits everything else. It is too expensive a trade. The seventh principle charts a third path between oversharing and isolation: the surgical, evidence-based construction of a small, highly verified inner circle. And every word of that description carries its weight. Small, not a coalition of sympathy, not a large network of people who are loosely aligned with your position. 3 people, maybe 5. People who know you at a level of depth and duration that constitutes real understanding of who you are beyond this specific situation. People whose loyalty is not contingent on the purity of the narrative about what happened. Because they are not loyal to the narrative, they are loyal to you. People whose access to your genuine strategic thinking is warranted by the quality and consistency of their demonstrated reliability. Evidence-based, not hopeful, not assumed from the warmth of your relationship, demonstrated through behavior under actual conditions of cost. Who showed up when showing up was inconvenient. Who maintained your confidence when sharing it would have been socially rewarding. Who gave you honest perspective when flattery would have been easier and more comfortable. Who has been willing, in real situations at real cost to themselves, to prioritize their relationship with you over the social comfort of aligning with whatever is most popular or convenient in the environment. These behaviors, observed under actual conditions, are the evidence. Trust built on this evidence is genuinely reliable. Trust assumed from warmth and proximity without this evidence is the same structural vulnerability that made the original betrayal possible. Verified. This is where the strategic test from the third principle connects to the alliance management of the seventh. You do not simply assess people's reliability from observation. You create low-cost, low-stakes situations that generate real evidence about how they handle the specific trust dimension that matters most in a complex social conflict: discretion under social pressure. The person who maintains your confidence when doing so, requires no effort from them, has passed a relatively low bar. The person who maintains it when sharing would be socially rewarding, when silence requires active resistance to a conversational current that is running toward disclosure. That person has demonstrated something genuinely significant. Let the tests do the work of building the verified inner circle, rather than relying on assumption. The specific people who belong in your inner circle, the 2 or 3 or 4 who have passed the relevant tests, who have demonstrated the qualities that genuine reliability requires, these people get full access to your actual strategic thinking, your genuine internal state, your real assessment of the situation and what you are planning to do about it. This is not the surface version. This is the real version, and you give it to them because they have earned it, because they can actually hold it with the discretion and the intelligence and the genuine alignment with your interests that warrants the investment of your full trust. Everyone else in the environment, including people you like, including people whose support feels genuine, including people whose loyalty might actually be real but has not yet been tested, gets a surface version. Appropriate, warm, honest in its broad strokes, but not containing the private intelligence that belongs only in the verified inner circle. This is not deception. It is calibration. It is exactly what every person who holds information that matters in a complex environment does as a matter of functional intelligence. You allocate access proportionate to what has been earned. No more, no less. And you manage the inner circle with ongoing attention. People's positions change. Circumstances change, pressures change. The person who was reliably discreet in one set of conditions may face a different set of conditions in the future that their discretion is not equal to. The ongoing observation that the second principle established does not stop at the edges of your inner circle. It continues more gently and with more positive baseline assumption within it as well. Real alliances are maintained, not merely established. The eighth principle is the one that Machiavelli would consider the most powerful, the most lasting, and the most complete. Not because it involves the most sophisticated strategic calculation, because it requires the most genuine commitment to your own actual life as the primary arena of your energy and your capability. It is the decision, deliberate, sustained, consistently enacted over time, to let the quality and trajectory of your life become the response to everything that was done to you and everything that was said about you. When someone plays dirty with you, they make an implicit argument. It is an argument embedded in their action rather than stated in their words, but it is real, and it carries real stakes. The argument, at its most fundamental level, is this: you are someone who can be used without serious consequence, someone whose interests can be subordinated to the interests of a person willing to make that choice, someone who does not see clearly enough, or who does not hold their position firmly enough, or whose capabilities are sufficiently limited, that what is lost to them by the betrayal is an acceptable cost for what is gained by the person who perpetrated it. This argument may never be articulated. The person who wronged you may not have consciously formulated it in these terms, but it is embedded in the choice they made, the choice to prioritize their own advantage over your dignity and your interests. And it stands in the environment as a position that either gets confirmed by subsequent events or gets refuted by them. You can refute it with words. You can present your case, argue your position, correct the record, assert your version of events. And sometimes this is appropriate and necessary, but words are weak instruments for this particular purpose. They require the listener to be willing and able to fairly evaluate competing accounts, to hold the complexity of a real human situation and weight the evidence with genuine equity, to resist the pull toward whichever version is simpler or more emotionally comfortable or better aligned with their existing relationships with the relevant parties. And in the specific conditions of the aftermath of a betrayal, where the other person may have had time to shape the narrative, where the social environment has already received some version of events, where genuine equity requires the kind of effort that most people do not choose to exert when a simpler version is available. These conditions for fair evaluation often do not exist. Results are different. Results exist independently of evaluation conditions. The quality of your work speaks for itself in environments where the person evaluating it may not even know your history with the person who wronged you. The trajectory of your career or your projects or your capabilities speaks for itself in the ongoing evidence it provides, day after day, of a person who is moving forward with genuine capability. The depth and quality of your relationships speak for themselves in the straightforward visibility of a person who is genuinely connected, genuinely valued, genuinely invested in, and receiving investment from people who know them well. These things cannot be argued with. They do not require the listener to be generous or fair. They simply exist in the environment as the most comprehensive, most continuously updated, most impossible to dismiss evidence about who you are and what you are building. And over time, over the weeks and months and years during which you are consistently building, they outgrow the conflict. They become so much larger than what happened, so much more present and visible and undeniable, that the conflict becomes a smaller and smaller feature of an increasingly large and full landscape. This is not a consolation prize. This is not making the best of a bad situation. This is the actual win, the only win that is genuinely complete, the only outcome that provides something better than justice, a life that has turned the cost of the betrayal into the fuel for the building. That has made the wound the origin point of a capability and a clarity that the unwounded version of yourself would not have developed, that has emerged from the most difficult chapter, not just intact, but fundamentally more capable and more clear. Begin building that life now, not after the situation is resolved. There may not be a clean resolution, and waiting for one before you begin building makes the resolution itself an obstacle to the very outcome you are building toward. Not after the wound has healed. Healing happens alongside the building, not instead of it, and the act of genuinely building often accelerates the healing in ways that focused attention on the wound never does. Now, with whatever is genuinely available to you today, the piece of work that deserves your full capability, rather than the fraction of it that the preoccupation of the wound has been allowing, the relationship that is real and alive, and that benefits from your genuine presence, rather than the distracted management of someone whose attention is divided between the living present and the dead past. The project, the skill, the ambition that reflects your actual depth and your actual potential, rather than the contracted version of yourself that ongoing emotional investment in a betrayal tends to produce. Build with everything you have, and let the building compound day by day into the undeniable evidence of a person whose actual life is the final, complete, irrefutable answer to every story ever told to diminish them. You have arrived somewhere new. Let that land fully. You came to this video carrying something, a wound, a confusion, a frustration that had not found its resolution in any of the frameworks you had been offered before, an unresolved sense of having been treated in a way you did not deserve, by someone you had trusted in a way they did not deserve, a particular kind of exhaustion, the exhaustion of a person who has been trying to process an experience that the available processing frameworks were not actually designed to resolve. You are leaving it with a different architecture, not with the wound erased. Wounds take the time they take, and the honest work of healing is real and it is yours and it proceeds at its own genuine pace. But with the map, with the 10 operational principles that transform the experience of having been played dirty from a story about what was done to you into a curriculum in the specific kind of intelligence that will serve you, compoundingly, in every complex human environment you will ever navigate. Silence as discipline and as power. Observation without disclosure as intelligence collection. Controlled release of information as strategic asset management. severing the emotional contract as the foundation of genuine freedom, mastery of timing as the difference between the emotionally satisfying move and the strategically effective one, the alternate surface as the protection of your most private resources from those who have not earned access to them, the disciplined management of alliances as the surgical construction of genuine capability rather than the broad accumulation of sympathetic audience, the excellence of undeniable results as the final, complete, unreachable answer to every diminishing narrative, strategic and proportionate accountability as the precise, well-timed signal that you are not someone to play dirty against without consequence, and the integration of the wound into your permanent architecture as the decision to let what cost you become what equips you. These are not steps in a sequence that you complete and set aside. They are a philosophy, a way of engaging with human nature and the complex social environments in which it plays out, a way that is simultaneously more honest and more capable than the alternatives. More honest because it does not require you to pretend the world is simpler or kinder or more uniformly fair than it actually is. More capable because it provides you with the tools to navigate the world as it actually is, rather than managing the repeated surprise of finding that it is not what you hoped. Machiavelli built this philosophy for the person who had been tested by reality and had decided, rather than retreating into protective illusion or hardening into bitter cynicism, to engage with the actual complexity of human behavior from a place of clear-eyed sovereign intelligence, not a person who has stopped loving, not a person who has given up on trust or connection or genuine relationship, but a person who has added, underneath all of those genuinely valuable qualities, the layer of discernment and precision and strategic awareness that protects them. That makes the warmth sustainable. That makes the trust proportionate. That makes the generosity calibrated rather than indiscriminate. That makes the openness a choice rather than an exposure. You are becoming that person in real time, with the specific experience you brought here, the specific wound, the specific betrayal, the specific person whose actions have brought you to this exact moment in your understanding as the raw material for the transformation. You did not choose to pay the price of that experience, but you are choosing now how to use what the price purchased. And what it purchased, if you take these principles seriously, if you practice them with genuine discipline, if you let them work the way that sustained application of real principles always works, is the permanent, structural revision of your intelligence about human nature. The closing of the gap, the end of the pattern. If what was said here reached something real in you, if you feel the weight of these principles settling not just into your thinking, but into the deeper part of you where genuine shifts of understanding actually land, then I want you to do one thing. Leave a comment below with this phrase and mean every word of it when you write it. My silence is my power, not as a declaration for anyone else, as a commitment to yourself, as the mark of the line between the version of you who operated without this framework and the version who now carries it, as the beginning of the practice. And if you understand that what was shared here today is only the beginning, that the application of these principles to real situations deepens and refines them in ways that no single video can fully anticipate, that the development of genuine strategic intelligence is a practice that rewards sustained engagement, that the body of knowledge Machiavelli built, and that serious thinkers have continued to develop across 5 centuries of application, contains more depth and more nuance than any single conversation can exhaust, then subscribe to this channel. Not as a casual addition to a queue you rarely revisit, as the deliberate choice to continue building the architecture that today began. As the recognition that the kind of intelligence this channel exists to develop is worth the sustained investment of your attention. This channel is a fortress of clarity, built for the people who are done with comfortable fictions about human nature and ready to engage with human nature as it actually is, with all of its complexity, its self-interest, its capacity for both genuine warmth and genuine strategic calculation, from a place of sovereign, precise, unillusioned intelligence. You just proved you are one of those people. Go now. Let the silence do its work. Let the observation build your map. Let the internal work produce the composure that no performance can sustain. Let the building compound into the undeniable evidence of who you actually are. Let the 10 moves become not what you apply, but what you are. And let every person who ever looked at you and saw someone they could afford to play dirty against, let them watch from whatever distance they end up at, as the version of you they tried to diminish becomes the version of you they can no longer reach. They played their game on the old version of you. The new version has the map. The new version knows the rules. The new version plays with a quality of intelligence they never anticipated and will never be able to fully account for. The new version cannot be played. Not because the new version trusts no one, because the new version knows exactly who has earned what. Go. And build something they cannot argue with. The 9th principle is one of the most frequently misunderstood in the entire Machiavellian framework, and the misunderstanding operates in both directions simultaneously, which is unusual. Some people, when they encounter this principle, over-apply it in the direction of aggression, using it as justification for a kind of retaliatory campaign that far exceeds what the principle actually calls for, and that transforms them from the wronged party into an aggressor whose behavior becomes the story. Others under-apply it out of a commitment to the moral high ground, interpreting it as optional, as the less evolved response, as something that a person of real character should be able to move past without needing to enact. Both misunderstandings produce the same outcome. The person who played dirty against you experiences no meaningful consequence for having done so, and that absence of consequence is itself a problem, not primarily for moral reasons, though the moral dimension is real, but for strategic ones. When someone plays dirty against you and faces no consequence, not from you, not from the environment, not from any circumstance, they receive a signal. The signal is clear, even if no one articulates it explicitly. Playing dirty against this person is a low-risk activity. The cost of the action was acceptable. The calculation made in advance of the betrayal that what could be gained by acting against your interests was worth the risk of the consequences has been validated, and validated calculations get repeated. Not necessarily by the same person against you specifically, though that possibility exists, but as a pattern. A reputation established through the absence of consequence. That invites repetition. The 9th principle, strategic and proportionate accountability, is the precise, well-timed, carefully calibrated correction of this signal, not revenge. The distinction between strategic accountability and revenge is not merely semantic. It is structural, and it determines entirely whether the action serves your interests or costs you them. Revenge is organized around the wound and its emotional urgency. It is backward-looking. It is focused on what happened and on producing a consequence that feels commensurate with the pain of what was done. It is emotionally driven. It is executed when the emotional pressure for it peaks, rather than when the conditions for effective execution are optimal. And it tends toward excess, because what the wound wants is not proportionate consequence, but the restoration of the sense of justice that the betrayal destroyed, and that restoration requires consequences that feel as total as the violation felt. The problem with excess is that it tips the moral balance of the situation. When the consequence exceeds the action, when what you do in response is clearly disproportionate to what was done, you become the aggressor. The narrative shifts. The original wrong gets contextualized into irrelevance by the scale of your response. And the person who wronged you, who was the clear protagonist of the story of what happened, becomes something more sympathetic, the target of an apparently extreme and disproportionate response from someone who has clearly lost their objectivity. You lose the moral high ground. You lose the coherent position, and you hand the other person a narrative that is far more useful to them than anything they had before your response handed it to them. Strategic accountability is organized entirely differently. It is forward-looking. It is focused not on what happened, but on what the optimal consequence of what happened should be, given your actual strategic interests going forward. It is analytically driven. It is executed when the conditions for maximum effectiveness exist, rather than when the emotional pressure for it peaks. And it is proportionate. It is calibrated precisely to the specific wrong that was done, targeting the specific advantage the other person gained at your expense, rather than attempting to demolish everything they have built or everything they are. What does proportionate mean in practice? It means identifying the specific currency in which the wrong was done and addressing that specific currency with precision. If the wrong involved the theft or misrepresentation of your work or your contribution, accountability means ensuring that the accurate record of your contribution is visible and attributable in the contexts where it matters. Not a loud, defensive assertion, but a quiet, systematic restoration of the factual record. If the wrong involved the use of private information you shared in confidence as ammunition in a social or professional context, accountability means ensuring that the people who received that ammunition also receive the fuller, more accurate context that makes the use of it visible for what it was. If the wrong involved the deliberate undermining of your position or reputation, accountability means producing the specific evidence through your work, through the testimony of people who know your actual character and capability, through the factual record of the situation, that makes the undermining attempt visible as what it was. In each case, the accountability is targeted. It addresses the specific wrong. It corrects the specific imbalance the wrong created, and it stops there, because the point is not maximum damage to the person who wronged you, but the restoration of your own position and the sending of a clear signal about the cost of playing dirty against you. Timing, again, is everything here. The ninth principle is one of the most timing-sensitive in the framework. Executed too early, when your emotional state is still reactive, when the full picture of the situation is still emerging, when you have not yet had the opportunity to observe the full consequences of the other person's actions and the full vulnerability those consequences have created in their position, the accountability move will almost certainly be either disproportionate, premature, or both. Executed at the right moment, when the conditions are genuinely optimal, when you have gathered sufficient intelligence, when the specific vulnerability you are targeting is most exposed, when your own position is most secure, it lands with a precision and an effectiveness that the premature version would never approach. How do you know when the time is right for the accountability move? Several conditions need to be simultaneously true. Your emotional state needs to be genuinely stable, not managed, not performed but actually stable in the way that the internal work of the earlier principles produces. The information you need to execute the move accurately and precisely needs to be in your possession, not assumed, not hoped, but verified through observation and intelligence gathering. Your own position in the relevant environment needs to be sufficiently secure that the move does not create collateral vulnerabilities you cannot manage, and the specific target of the move, the particular advantage the other person gained, the particular imbalance you are correcting, needs to be clearly identified and accessible. When all four of these conditions are true simultaneously, the window is open. Move through it with precision. Execute the accountability with the specific calibration the situation warrants, and then stop. Do not follow the accountability move with additional moves designed to compound the consequence beyond what proportionality calls for. The effectiveness of strategic accountability comes precisely from its precision, from the fact that it is clearly aimed at something specific, clearly proportionate to what was done, and clearly organized around the restoration of your position rather than the destruction of theirs. Excess destroys this clarity and turns the narrative against you. After the move, silence. The move speaks for itself. You do not explain it. You do not justify it. You do not seek acknowledgement from the other person or from witnesses that it was appropriate. You make the move, and you return to the forward-building orientation of the eighth principle. The accountability move was a correction of a specific imbalance. Once the correction has been made, the imbalance no longer requires your active attention. Your attention returns to the building. This is what distinguishes strategic accountability from the ongoing dynamic of revenge. Revenge requires continuous engagement with the other person and the wrong they did because the emotional organization around the wound that drives revenge is never fully satisfied by any single action. Strategic accountability is discrete. It addresses a specific thing, it does it with precision, and it is done. What follows belongs to the forward trajectory, not to the conflict. The 10th principle is the one that completes the framework, and that Machiavelli, in the full arc of his thinking about power and its navigation, would consider the most philosophically significant. It is also the one that is hardest to fully articulate, because it is less a tactical principle and more a fundamental reorientation of your relationship to the experience of having been wronged. The 10th principle is the integration of the wound into your permanent strategic architecture. The decision to transform what happened from an experience that cost you into an asset that equips you, without denying the real cost, without performing a recovery you have not genuinely made, but also without remaining organized around a loss when the most powerful response to loss is always, ultimately, what you build from it. What does integration mean precisely? Not forgetting, not minimizing, not the performance of a magnanimity that turns the other cheek and declares that what happened is no longer relevant, and wishes the other person well, and moves on with a demonstratively untroubled heart. All of that is performance rather than integration, and performance at this depth costs more than it produces. What integration means is something at once simpler and more complete, the genuine assimilation of what you learned from the experience into the way you navigate the world going forward. Not as a conscious checklist you consult, as a naturalized intelligence, as an instinct that has been built, through the actual experience of betrayal and its navigation, into the structure of how you perceive and respond to the human environments you move through. Think about what you know now that you did not know before. Before this experience, you had a theoretical understanding that people sometimes act against the interests of those who trust them. You may have known this abstractly, may have even known it from previous experiences. But you now know it in a way that is qualitatively different from abstract knowledge. You know it at the level of the body, the level of pattern recognition, the level of the instinct that fires before conscious analysis has fully engaged. You know the specific texture of the warmth that functions as a delivery mechanism for something else. You know the specific quality of attention that accumulates information as inventory, rather than receiving it as the substance of genuine connection. You know the specific behavioral signature of someone who is managing your perception rather than simply relating to you. You know these things not because you have studied them in a book, but because you have lived them, with real consequences, in a real situation with real stakes. That knowledge, the kind that lives in the body rather than in the mind, the kind that cannot be unlearned because it is part of your experience now rather than part of your information, is one of the most valuable things you can possess in the navigation of complex human environments. It is the specific perceptual capacity that allows you to register the early signals of a problematic dynamic before those signals reach the conscious threshold. The low-level unease, the slight incongruence between what someone says and what they do, the subtle quality of attention that distinguishes genuine interest from strategic information gathering, and to act on those early registrations rather than explaining them away in favor of the warmer interpretation. You had the warmer interpretation before. It cost you. You have the accurate interpretation now. It will protect you, not by closing you off, not by making you unwilling to extend trust, but by making your extension of trust more calibrated, more proportionate to evidence, and therefore more genuinely sustainable over time. But integration means more than the passive retention of experiential learning. It means the active choice to let this experience be the origin point of a more capable version of yourself, to use the wound not merely as a cautionary lesson, but as the specific pressure under which a more sophisticated quality of intelligence was formed. The same way that extreme physical training produces muscle and cardiovascular capacity that could not have been developed through ordinary exercise, the experience of navigating a genuine betrayal with real stakes and real consequences, when it is engaged with fully rather than merely survived, produces a quality of strategic and emotional intelligence that could not have been developed any other way. You would not have chosen this education, no one would, but the question of whether you chose it is already settled. You did not, and the experience happened regardless of your preference. The only question that remains open, the only question that you have actual agency over, is what you do with the education now that it has been delivered. Whether you carry it as a wound that diminishes you, as a scar that you show people to explain your caution, as an injustice that defines the story of a period of your life, or whether you carry it as what it actually is, at its most accurate and most useful, the specific raw material from which a more capable, more precise, more genuinely intelligent version of yourself has been built. The integration is the choice of the second option, not as a motivational declaration, not as a performance of resilience, as a genuine, sustained, daily commitment to treating your own life, your ongoing, continuing present and future life, as the primary arena for your energy, your intelligence, and your capability. The wound is real. The cost was real. The experience belongs to your history, and the history is the foundation for the forward trajectory rather than the subject of the ongoing story. This is what it means to be truly unplayable. Not to trust no one, not to maintain permanent defensive distance from everyone who might possibly have the capacity to wrong you, not to process the world through a lens of suspicion that protects you from betrayal by also protecting you from everything that makes life worth living, but to be genuinely, deeply trustworthy yourself, and to extend trust where it has been earned carefully, proportionate to evidence, with the specific discernment that the integration of this experience has built into your perceptual architecture. And to know, not with hope but with the real knowledge that comes from having developed the tools, that if someone ever tries to play dirty against you again, you will see it earlier, you will respond more effectively, and you will emerge from it with less cost and more capability than the last time. Because the last time was the time when you did not have the map. This time, and every time from now forward, you carry it. What does it feel like to carry it? Not like armor, which is heavy and restrictive, and communicates to the world that you are protected, which communicates vulnerability as clearly as the absence of protection does. Not like a mask, which requires constant maintenance and which hides who you are at the cost of your ability to be genuinely present. It feels like clarity. It feels like the particular confidence of someone who is seeing accurately rather than hoping accurately. It feels like the quality of presence that belongs to a person who has settled, finally, into an honest relationship with the world as it actually is, who has stopped spending energy on the gap between how things should be and how they are, and who has invested that energy instead into becoming genuinely capable of navigating how things are. It is a specific kind of peace, not the peace of the wound having healed entirely, which happens gradually and in its own time, but the peace of knowing what to do, of having the map, of understanding, with the specific understanding that only experience and the right framework together can produce, that what was done to you did not diminish you, that it could not, that everything it took from you, the trust, the investment, the specific hope that the relationship would continue to be what you believed it was, those things were real, and their loss was real, and you are allowed to grieve them. But underneath everything that was taken, there is something that cannot be taken, something that the betrayal, in its very completeness, in the totality of what it forced you to confront and navigate, has actually strengthened. The clarity, the capability, the map, and now you carry all three. Go. The world is exactly as complex as it always was. The people in it are exactly as varied in their integrity and their intentions as they have always been. The environments you navigate are exactly as full of competing interests, shifting alliances, and strategic calculations as they have always been. None of that has changed. What has changed is the quality of the intelligence you bring to it. What has changed is the layer underneath your warmth, your openness, your genuine desire for real connection. What has changed is the gap between what you know about how the game is played and what everyone who might ever try to play it against you knows. That gap, the gap that the betrayal exploited, has been closed. Not by becoming someone different, by becoming more completely, more capably, more precisely and more sovereignly yourself. Go build the life that is commensurate with that capability. Let the silence speak first. Let the observation build the map. Let the internal work produce the freedom that no external resolution can provide. Let the results compound into the undeniable evidence of who you actually are. And let every person who ever thought they could afford to underestimate you watch from whatever distance they have put between themselves and the person they thought they played, as the version of you that survived what they did becomes the version of you that they can no longer reach, that they can no longer read, that they can no longer afford to play against. They underestimated you once. The education that underestimation has provided is worth more than what it cost, and you are spending it now with precision in the construction of a life they never calculated. That life is the final move in a game they thought they had already won. Play it well.